The hammer fell like judgment, sparks erupting from orange metal that screamed beneath each blow. Silas Grimwood's arms moved with the rhythm of a man who had struck iron 10,000 times, maybe 20,000, each impact a prayer and a curse bound together in the marriage of muscle and steel. The forge breathed like a living thing in the Mississippi night, exhaling heat that turned the air to syrup, thick enough to choke on. Sweat carved rivers through the cold dust on his bare chest, pooling in the hollows of his collarbones before dripping onto the hard-packed earth floor where it hissed into nothing. He should have stopped hours ago. The moon had risen full and fat, hanging low enough to touch the tops of the magnolia trees that lined the dirt road leading to the quarters. But sleep was a luxury Silas could no longer afford, not since the dreams had started, dreams of fire that spoke in his daughter's voice, dreams of iron that remembered every hand it had bound. The piece he worked on now was meant to be a hinge for the smokehouse door, but his hammer had other ideas. The metal curled wrong, twisted into something that wanted to be a hook, or perhaps a talon. He thrust it back into the coals with more force than necessary, pumping the bellows until the forge roared, until the heat pushed him back a step and painted his face orange as a jack-o'-lantern. That's when he heard the boots. Not the shuffle of the enslaved returning from the fields, not the quick patter of children darting between buildings. These were deliberate, heavy, with the particular cadence of a white man who knew every step he took was built on the backs of others. Silas didn't turn, didn't pause in his work. He pulled the iron from the coals and brought the hammer down again, once, twice, 3 times. Each strike a heartbeat. Each heartbeat a moment longer before he'd have to face whatever fresh hell was walking toward him. "Well now, ain't you industrious?" Dalton Merrick's voice slithered through the darkness, thick with whiskey and something meaner. The overseer materialized at the edge of the firelight, his face half in shadow, half illuminated like a bruised moon. He swayed slightly, one hand resting on the coiled whip at his belt. The leather was dark with old blood, some of it Silas's own. "Working late, or is it early? I confess I've lost track." Silas set the hammer down with careful precision, turning to face the overseer but keeping his eyes lowered. The rules were simple, had been beaten into him along with the forge craft: never meet their eyes, never speak unless spoken to, never let them see the rage that lived in your chest like a second heart. "Just finishing some repairs, sir. The smokehouse hinge split today." Hum. Merrick took 3 steps closer, bringing with him the reek of bourbon and tobacco. "The thing is, Silas, may I call you Silas?" "Of course I can call you anything I damn well please. Thing is, I've got a more pressing need for those talented hands of yours." The overseer reached into his coat and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper, unfolding it with exaggerated care. Even in the uncertain light, Silas could see it was a bill of sale. His stomach turned to ice despite the forge's heat. Little Betsy Hale, aged 8, being sold to the Worthington plantation came at sunrise. "Her mama's taken it poorly, as these creatures do." Merrick spoke as if discussing livestock, which in his eyes, Silas supposed, they were. "She's been wailing something fierce, disturbing Master Langridge's rest. So he's decided, in his infinite mercy, that the child needs proper restraints for the journey. Small wrists, mind you. Delicate work. That's where you come in." The words hung in the air between them like smoke. Silas felt his hands begin to tremble, a tremor that started in his fingertips and threatened to spread up his arms. He knew Betsy Hale. Everyone in the quarters knew her, a girl with her mama's bright eyes and a laugh that could make even the most broken soul remember what joy sounded like. Last week she'd brought him a speckled feather she'd found, declaring it was magic and he should keep it for luck. It was still tucked into a crack in the forge's stone wall. "I need proper manacles, Silas. Small enough for a child, strong enough she can't slip free. Master Langridge is hosting his harvest celebration tomorrow night, you see, and he wants all business concluded beforehand. Clean slate and all that." Merrick's smile was a wound across his face. "You understand?" Silas understood. He understood that if he refused, the whip would sing. He understood that if he worked too slowly, Betsy's mother might face worse. He understood that the iron he shaped would lock around the wrists of a child who still believed feathers carried magic. He understood, most of all, that this moment, this very moment, was one of 10,000 cuts that would either kill him slowly or transform him into something else entirely. "Yes, sir," he whispered. "I understand." Good. Merrick leaned against one of the support posts, settling in to watch. Don't mind me. I'll just wait here to ensure the work's done properly. And Silas? Make them pretty. Master Langridge appreciates craftsmanship. The overseer's words landed like acid on Silas's skin. Pretty chains for a child. Art in the service of atrocity. Silas turned back to the forge, his movements mechanical now, automatic. He selected a piece of iron stock, checking its weight and quality with hands that had performed this ritual countless times. The metal was good, too good for what he was about to make. He thrust it into the coals, watching as it began to glow, first red, then orange, then yellow-white. The heat beat against his face like fists. You know, Merrick said, his voice deceptively casual, this reminds me of your own girl. What was her name? Cassie? Callie? Clara? The name escaped Silas's lips before he could stop it, and he cursed himself for the weakness. Clara. That's right. Pretty little thing, she was. Got a good price for her too, 3 years back. Master Langridge needed new horses for his wife's carriage, you see. Economics, Silas. Simple economics. Merrick took a long pull from a flask Silas hadn't noticed him holding. I wonder if she still remembers you. Children that age, they forget so quickly. Probably call another man daddy by now. The words were calculated, designed to wound, and they found their mark with the precision of a well-aimed blade. Silas pulled the iron from the forge and brought the hammer down so hard the anvil rang like a bell. Sparks scattered across the floor, dying like falling stars. He struck again and again, shaping the metal, bending it, forcing it into the curve that would encircle a child's wrist. His vision blurred, whether from sweat or tears he couldn't say, wouldn't acknowledge. That's it, Merrick encouraged, mistaking anguish for effort. Put some muscle into it. We want them to be secure. Time lost meaning in the forge. There was only the hammer and the metal, the heat and the hate. Silas shaped one manacle, then another, working with a precision that came from years of practice and a hatred that came from something deeper than years, older than memory. His hands knew what to do even as his mind drifted to dangerous places, to Clara's face the morning they took her, screaming for him while he stood chained to this very post, helpless. To the sound of the wagon wheels carrying her away. To the silence that followed, louder than any scream. When he finished, the manacles lay on the anvil like sleeping serpents, small and terrible. He'd made them exactly to specifications, strong enough to hold, sized for a child, with a short chain between them that would make running impossible. They were, as requested, crafted with skill. Perfect instruments of captivity. Excellent work, Silas. Truly excellent. Merrick pushed himself upright, staggering slightly as the whiskey caught up with him. He picked up the manacles, testing their weight. Master Langridge will be pleased. That's 2 marks in your favor, good work and quick work. Keep this up and maybe you'll earn yourself an extra cornmeal ration come winter. The overseer tucked the chains into his coat pocket, where they clinked together with a sound like tiny bells. Like laughter. Like weeping. Oh, and Silas. Master Langridge wants to see you at the house tomorrow evening. He's having some trouble with the chandelier chain in the dining room, link's gone weak. He wants you to repair it during the celebration. Let the guests see what fine craftsmen we keep here at Langridge Estate. Merrick grinned. Wear something clean. Then he was gone, swallowed by the darkness beyond the forge's light, his boots crunching on gravel as he made his unsteady way back toward the overseer's quarters. Silas stood motionless for a long time after Merrick left, staring at his hands. They were bleeding, he'd gripped the hammer so hard the wooden handle had torn open old calluses. Blood dripped onto the hard earth, then onto the anvil, then finally onto the hinge he'd been working on before the overseer's arrival. The metal was cool now, almost cool enough to touch, but it still held a faint glow deep in its core. Like embers. Like memories. He moved to the back of the forge where the shadows were deepest, where Merrick's whiskey-addled eyes couldn't have penetrated even if he'd bothered to look. There, hidden behind a false stone in the forge wall, was Silas's secret, a collection of things that shouldn't exist, that spoke of knowledge older than the chains, older than the plantation, older than the word slavery itself. His grandmother had given him these things before she died, pressing them into his hands with fingers like dried twigs and eyes that had seen the middle passage, had seen the auction block, had seen her own children sold away one by one. "You got the gift," she'd whispered. "Iron remembers, Silas. Iron never forgets. And when the time comes, iron speaks." He hadn't understood then. He'd been young, foolish, still believing that if he kept his head down and worked hard, somehow things might get better. But Clara's sale had taught him otherwise. 3 years of watching that empty space where his daughter used to sleep. 3 years of forging chains and shackles and locks. 3 years of iron remembering. Now, Silas pulled out a small leather pouch, its contents clinking softly. Inside were metal fragments, a nail from his grandmother's coffin, a piece of the chain that had bound his father, a link from the first manacles he'd ever been forced to forge. And something else, a sliver of iron shaped like a thorn, black as midnight, that his grandmother claimed came from across the sea, from the old country, from a time before chains. He knelt on the forge floor, his blood still dripping, and arranged the fragments in a pattern his grandmother had shown him, a pattern that looked almost like a crossbeam, almost like a man with arms outstretched. He whispered words she'd taught him, syllables that felt wrong on his tongue, consonants that clicked like breaking bones. The language of iron. The language of debt and payment. The forge flared suddenly, though Silas hadn't touched the bellows. The flames burned blue for just a moment, just long enough for him to see shadows moving within them, shadows with the shapes of people, reaching out with hands that dissolved into smoke. "Soon," Silas whispered, his voice raw. "Soon." He gathered the metal fragments and returned them to their hiding place, then stood and surveyed his work area. Tomorrow night, the harvest celebration. Master Langridge and his guests, drunk on wine and power. Preston Langridge, the young master who claimed to be educated, to be enlightened, yet still traded human lives like poker chips. Overseer Wade Pickett, quieter than Merrick but no less cruel. And Merrick himself, with his whip and his whiskey and his words designed to cut deeper than any blade. Silas picked up the hinge he'd been working on, the one now marked with his blood. It was twisted wrong, ruined, and would never fit any door. But in its curves and angles, he could see something else, the shape of vengeance, the architecture of retribution. He set it carefully on a shelf where it joined other mistakes, other pieces of iron that had refused to become what their masters intended. Outside, the first birds began their pre-dawn songs, and the moon sank toward the horizon like a drowning man. In a few hours, the plantation would wake. Betsy Hale would be torn from her mother's arms, the manacles, his manacles, locked around her small wrists. The harvest celebration would begin its preparations. Life would continue in its terrible, ordinary way. But something had shifted in the forge tonight. Some line had been crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. The iron had heard his whispers. The fire had shown him shadows. And Silas Grimwood, enslaved blacksmith of Langridge Estate, had finally stopped asking why and started asking when. He looked at his hands again, at the blood drying black in the creases of his palms, at the scars that mapped a lifetime of forced labor. These hands had made chains. But chains, he now understood, could be unmade. Locks could be broken. And iron, properly persuaded, could serve new masters. The hammer lay on the anvil, patient and waiting. Silas picked it up, feeling its familiar weight, but something was different now. It wasn't just a tool anymore. It was a weapon. An instrument of judgment. He had work to do. Preparations to make. But first, he would see the sun rise one more time over Langridge Estate. He would count the hours until tomorrow night's celebration. He would remember every face, every name, every cruelty. And he would forge. If you're drawn into this dark tale of vengeance and fire, subscribe to journey deeper into America's most macabre historical horrors. Drop a comment below. Do you believe in supernatural justice? The dawn came slow and red over Langridge Estate, bleeding through the Spanish moss that hung from ancient oaks like the hair of drowned women. Silas hadn't slept. He'd watched the sun claw its way above the cotton fields from the forge doorway, his body exhausted but his mind churning with possibilities that tasted like ash and iron on his tongue. The plantation woke in stages. First came the bell, 3 sharp clangs that shattered the humid silence like thrown stones. Then the doors of the quarters creaking open, bodies stumbling out into the half-light. Children crying. Women singing low work songs to steel themselves for another day. Men coughing the night from their lungs, preparing for the fields that stretched endless and white under the climbing sun. Silas moved among them like a ghost, acknowledged with nods and careful glances. Everyone knew the blacksmith kept strange hours, and maintained a solitude born of necessity. The forge required tending, they told themselves. The work never stopped. But some of the older ones, the ones who remembered Africa or had heard stories from those who did, they looked at him differently now. They saw something in his eyes that hadn't been there before, or perhaps had always been there but was only now surfacing like a drowned body rising from deep water. In the main house, Thaddeus Langridge stood at his bedroom window surveying his domain with the satisfaction of a man who believed God had personally ordained his prosperity. He was 53, thick through the middle but still strong in the shoulders, with silver threading through his dark hair in a way his wife assured him looked distinguished. His face bore the ruddy complexion of someone who enjoyed good whiskey and believed exercise was for horses and field hands. "The cotton's coming in beautiful this year," he said to Cordelia, who sat at her vanity arranging her auburn hair into an elaborate style that would require 2 enslaved women 3 hours to complete. "Might be our best harvest yet. The celebration tonight will be something to remember." Cordelia Langridge hummed her agreement, studying her reflection with the critical eye of a woman who understood that beauty was currency in the South, that a plantation wife's appearance reflected directly on her husband's success. She was 38 but looked younger, preserved by a life spent in shade while others labored in sun. "Have you decided on the menu? The Worthingtons are bringing that awful wine again. I do hope we're not expected to drink it." "We'll smile and drink whatever they bring," Thaddeus said, his tone carrying an edge. "Marcus Worthington controls half the gin houses in 3 counties. We need him amenable when it comes time to negotiate transport contracts." He didn't mention that Marcus Worthington was also taking delivery of a child this morning, little Betsy Hale, payment for a gambling debt Thaddeus preferred his wife didn't know about. The less Cordelia understood about the business side of the plantation, the better. Women, even intelligent ones like his wife, couldn't grasp the necessary calculations that made their comfortable life possible. Below in the kitchen, the enslaved were already preparing for the evening's feast. 20 guests expected, maybe more if the Hendersons decided to make the journey from their place near Vicksburg. Josephine, the head cook, moved through the controlled chaos with the authority of a general, her gray-streaked hair bound in a scarlet tignon, her dark hands directing younger women in the preparation of ham and quail, cornbread and syllabub. She was 60, maybe older, no one kept accurate records of such things, and had outlived 3 masters of Langridge Estate. She'd been born on this land when it was still wilderness, had watched the first cotton plants go into soil that had been Cherokee hunting grounds before Andrew Jackson's treaties opened it to white settlement. She'd seen things that would drive most people mad, had survived by becoming indispensable, by knowing secrets that masters preferred stayed buried. And she knew Silas's grandmother. Had learned some of the same old ways, the same old words that predated Christianity and slavery both. "You." She pointed at a young woman named Ruth who was plucking quail with trembling hands. "What's got you shaking like that?" "Nothing, Miss Josephine. Just tired is all." Hum. Josephine's eyes were sharp as the knives she wielded. "You were at the quarters late last night. Saw you coming back from somewhere around midnight. Where have you been?" Ruth's hand stilled. "I had to, that is, I went to." "She went to see about her cousin's boy," another woman interjected. "He's been sick with fever." Josephine let the lie sit there between them, watching it squirm. She knew exactly where Ruth had been, down by the forge, watching Silas work while Dalton Merrick leaned drunk against the post. The whole quarters would know by now what Silas had been forced to make. News traveled fast in the invisible network that connected the enslaved, faster than any white master could imagine. "Well," Josephine said finally, returning to her own work. "Tonight we serve them their feast. Tomorrow we'll see what tomorrow brings." The word seemed innocuous enough, but something in her tone made the other women glance at each other nervously. Out in the fields, Preston Langridge rode his sorrel mare between rows of cotton, playing at being the attentive young master. He was 26, educated at the University of Virginia, and convinced that his northern schooling had given him enlightened views on the peculiar institution that funded his comfortable existence. He liked to think of himself as a benevolent overseer in training, someone who understood that treating property well increased its value. This philosophy didn't prevent him from selling Marcus, one of the field workers, to a visiting planter just last week. Business was business, after all, and the boy had been getting uppity, asking questions about learning to read. Better to sell him before he infected others with dangerous ideas. Now Preston spotted Wade Pickett, the head overseer, standing at the edge of the south field with his arms crossed. Where Dalton Merrick was all bluster and violence, Pickett was cold calculation. He was 39, lean as a scarecrow, with pale eyes that missed nothing and a face that never quite smiled. He'd been with Langridge Estate for 12 years and had perfected the art of maximum productivity through minimum visible cruelty. His punishments were precise, scientific almost. He kept detailed records of every enslaved person's output, their weaknesses, their connections to others. Information was power, and Pickett collected information the way some men collected coins. "Morning, Wade," Preston called, riding up. "Fields look good." "They do," Pickett agreed. "Though we're short-handed with Marcus gone." The sale was poorly timed. Preston bristled at the implied criticism. "Father approved it." "I'm sure he did." Pickett's tone revealed nothing. "I'm simply noting that harvest timing is delicate. We can't afford delays." "Then work them harder." "That's what you're paid for, isn't it?" Pickett turned his pale eyes on the young master, and for a moment something flickered there, contempt, perhaps, or calculation. "Of course, Master Preston. I'll see it done." After Preston rode off, Pickett remained at the field's edge, watching the laborers move through the rows. His mind was already working through the implications of tonight's celebration. Thaddeus Langridge drunk and expansive, showing off for his peers. Security would be lax. The enslaved would be moving freely between the kitchen and dining room. And that business with the blacksmith this morning, Merrick forcing him to make those child-sized manacles, Pickett had heard about it from his network of informants. Such things created resentment, and resentment was dangerous if not properly managed. He made a mental note to keep an eye on Silas Grimwood tonight. Back in the quarters, young Marcus, not the one who'd been sold, but another boy of the same name, 12 years old with arms already corded with muscle from field work, found Silas behind the forge, hammering out horseshoe nails with mechanical precision. "Mr. Silas?" The boy's voice was tentative. "Miss Josephine says you're to come to the main house at 6 bells tonight. Says Master Langridge wants you for some chandelier work during the party." Silas set down his hammer and looked at the boy. Really looked at him. Marcus had his mother's eyes, his father's stubborn jaw. His father had been sold 2 years ago to a Louisiana sugar plantation, where the average enslaved man lasted 7 years before the work killed him. His mother scrubbed floors in the main house, where Preston Langridge had started noticing her in ways that made everyone nervous. "I know about tonight," Silas said quietly. "You tell Miss Josephine I'll be there." Marcus nodded but didn't leave. He shifted his weight from foot to foot, clearly wanting to say something else. "What is it, boy? Is it true? About Betsy Hale? About the chains you made?" Silas felt something twist in his chest. "Who told you that?" "Everyone knows. Ruth saw it. Said Merrick made you forge manacles small enough for a child." Marcus's young face was ancient with understanding. "They took her this morning, Mr. Silas. Betsy's mama tried to fight. Merrick beat her till she couldn't stand. Then they put those chains on Betsy and loaded her in a wagon." The boy's voice cracked on the last words. He was trying not to cry, trying to be strong, but 12 was still young enough to remember what hope felt like before the plantation ground it out of you. Silas stood there with blood drying under his fingernails and smoke in his lungs and something dark and patient uncoiling in his belly. "You go on now, Marcus. Help your mama. Stay close to her tonight, you understand? Stay close and stay in the quarters no matter what you hear." "Yes, sir." The boy started to leave, then turned back. "Mr. Silas. My daddy, before they sold him, he used to say that iron remembers. His daddy told him that, who learned it from your grandmother. Do you know what it means?" Silas looked at the forge, at the tools arranged just so, at the pieces of metal that had refused to become what their masters intended. "It means," he said slowly, "that everything has a reckoning. Everything comes due." Marcus nodded as if this made perfect sense, then ran off toward the quarters. The day crawled forward like something wounded. The sun climbed higher, turning the air to molten glass. In the fields, the enslaved worked with handkerchiefs tied over their faces against the cotton dust. In the main house, preparations for the evening reached a fever pitch. In the kitchen, Josephine sang old songs in a language that sounded like thunder and rainfall. And in the forge, Silas Grimwood worked. He wasn't making horseshoe nails anymore. Those lay forgotten on the workbench. Instead, his hammer rose and fell with patient rhythm as he shaped something else entirely. Long pieces of iron stock, each one carefully measured, each one heated to precise temperature and worked until it gleamed. They looked like nothing special, could have been stakes for a fence, supports for a gate, structural reinforcements for a dozen different purposes. But Silas knew what they were. His grandmother's voice whispered in his memory, teaching him the old craft, the one that had nothing to do with European blacksmithing and everything to do with older knowledge brought across the Middle Passage in the memories of those who'd survived. As he worked, birds fell from the sky. Just a few at first, a cardinal here, a mockingbird there, dropping onto the hard ground with soft thumps that no one seemed to notice. The forge fire burned strangely, occasionally flaring blue at its base, and once, just once, Silas could have sworn he saw faces in the flames. His daughter's face. His grandmother's. Others he didn't recognize but somehow knew, ancestors calling from across an ocean, across time itself. The tools on his workbench arranged themselves in patterns he hadn't made. A chisel here, a rasp there, forming shapes that looked almost like symbols, almost like writing in a language older than words. By afternoon, the temperature had climbed above 90. By evening, it would be hell itself. Perfect weather for a celebration. Perfect weather for fire. Silas examined his work as the sun began its slow descent toward the tree line. Everything was ready. Everything was prepared. Tonight, at 6 bells, he would go to the main house. He would repair Master Langridge's chandelier chain. He would be the good, useful, obedient blacksmith they thought they owned. And then he would show them what iron remembers. The sun hung swollen and red over Langridge Estate as evening descended like a fever dream. 6 bells hadn't yet rung, but already the plantation buzzed with an energy that felt wrong somehow, discordant, like music played on instruments that had gone subtly out of tune. Carriages rolled up the long oak-lined drive, disgorging men in fine coats and women in silks that cost more than an enslaved person's lifetime value. Their laughter carried across the grounds, bright and sharp as breaking glass. Silas washed himself at the pump behind the forge, scrubbing away 3 layers of soot and sweat with lye soap that burned his cracked hands. The water ran black at first, then gray, then finally clear, though he still felt filthy in ways no washing could remedy. He'd found a shirt that wasn't too patched, threadbare at the elbows but clean, and pulled it on over skin that bore the map of his bondage, whip scars across his back, burn marks on his forearms from years of forge work, a brand on his left shoulder that marked him as Langridge property. Josephine met him at the kitchen house, her face unreadable. She pressed a cloth bundle into his hands without speaking. Inside, he found corn bread still warm from the oven and a piece of salt pork. He hadn't eaten since yesterday. "You need strength for what's coming," she said quietly, her eyes scanning the yard to ensure they weren't observed. "Whatever that may be." Silas looked at her, this woman who'd survived longer than anyone had a right to survive, who'd buried children and grandchildren and watched the world grind itself into blood and cotton. "You know." It wasn't a question. Josephine's lips tightened into something that wasn't quite a smile. "I know you've been working on more than horseshoes. I know the forge been burning colors it shouldn't. I know birds have been falling dead in a circle around your workshop." She stepped closer, her voice dropping to barely a whisper. "And I know that old mark you carved into the crossbeam above your anvil, the one you think nobody sees. I know what that means, Silas Grimwood. My mama knew those signs. Her mama before her. Then you know I can't stop. Didn't say you should." Josephine glanced toward the main house where light blazed from every window. "But I'm saying this, fire don't discriminate. Once it starts burning, it takes everything. The guilty and the innocent both. You remember that when you strike whatever match you're planning to strike." Before Silas could respond, the 6 bells rang out across the estate, their tones somehow mournful despite the celebration they announced. Josephine squeezed his arm once, then turned back toward the kitchen where a dozen enslaved women worked to ferry food to the dining room. Silas walked toward the main house with the corn bread heavy in his stomach and his tool satchel heavier still on his shoulder. Inside the leather bag were the implements of his trade, hammers and pliers, files and punches. And something else, wrapped in oilcloth, that clinked softly with each step. The main house rose before him like a white sepulchre, its columns gleaming in the torchlight, its windows glowing with the warm amber of expensive candles. Music drifted out, a piano being played with more enthusiasm than skill, accompanied by voices raised in song. As Silas climbed the back stairs reserved for the enslaved, he could hear individual words from the popular tune, "My Old Kentucky Home, Far Away." The irony burned like acid in his throat. Wade Pickett intercepted him in the back hallway, materializing from shadows with the unsettling silence that characterized all his movements. "Grimwood. You're here for the chandelier." "Yes, sir." Pickett's pale eyes studied him with an intensity that made Silas's skin crawl. The overseer had a way of looking at people as if cataloging their weaknesses, filing away information for future use. "Master Langridge wants it done without disrupting the festivities. You'll work from the balcony, there's a ladder already positioned. Make it quick and quiet." "Yes, sir." "And Grimwood?" Pickett moved closer, near enough that Silas could smell tobacco and something else, something medicinal and bitter. "I've had my eye on you lately. Noticed some irregularities. Tools rearranged in patterns. Excess metal consumption. Birds dying near your forge." He paused, letting the words settle. "I don't believe in superstition, but I do believe in patterns. And patterns suggest intent. So I'll be watching you tonight. Carefully." The threat hung between them, explicit and undeniable. Silas kept his eyes lowered, his posture submissive, even as rage coiled tighter in his chest. "Just here to fix the chandelier, sir. Nothing more." Pickett held his gaze a moment longer, then stepped aside with a gesture toward the dining room. "See that it stays that way." The dining room was a monument to excess. The table stretched 20 feet, laden with ham and turkey, oysters and quail, sweet potatoes and cornbread, pies and cakes and syllabub in crystal glasses. Candles blazed in silver holders, their light reflecting off china that had been shipped from England and silverware that bore the Langridge family crest. 20 guests sat around the table, already flushed with wine and bourbon, their voices competing to be heard over one another. Thaddeus Langridge presided at the head, resplendent in a burgundy coat, gesturing expansively as he told some story about cotton futures that had his neighbors leaning forward with interest. Cordelia sat at the opposite end, a vision in emerald silk, managing the flow of conversation with practiced grace. Preston lounged halfway down the table, one arm draped over his chair back, holding court with several younger planters about his university days. And overhead, suspended from the ceiling by an elaborate chain mechanism, hung the chandelier in question. It was an ostentatious piece, brass and crystal, with 30 candles that made the entire room glow like the inside of a lantern. The chain that held it had indeed developed a weak link, visible even from the floor as a slight discoloration in the metal. Silas mounted the ladder that had been positioned against the interior balcony railing, climbing until he was level with the chandelier's suspension point. From this height, he could see everything, the guests gorging themselves below, the enslaved moving like shadows along the walls as they served and cleared, the windows open to catch any breeze that might relieve the oppressive heat. He could also see out those windows, across the grounds to where the quarters sat dark and quiet. To where the cotton gin house stood with its heaps of harvested fiber waiting to be processed. To where the barn and stables and smokehouse formed a constellation of wooden structures, all of them dry as kindling from the rainless summer. All of them are waiting. Silas opened his tool satchel and began examining the chandelier chain, making a show of testing each link with his pliers. The weak one was obvious, it had been improperly forged, probably by some Charleston manufacturer who'd never swung a hammer himself. He could replace it in 10 minutes. But that wasn't why he was here. Below, the dinner continued. Silas worked slowly, methodically, his ears catching fragments of conversation that made his hands clench around his tools. The cotton market's never been stronger. We're practically printing money. Had to sell off 3 breeders last month. Wasn't producing fast enough. That new fugitive slave law is exactly what we need. These abolitionists up north. And then, cutting through the other conversations like a knife, Preston Langridge's voice rose with cruel amusement. "Speaking of sales, father, I trust Marcus is settling in well with his new master." Silas's hands froze on the chain. Marcus. The boy who'd been sold just last week during the last gathering of planters. Auctioned off like livestock while his mother scrubbed floors 2 rooms away. Thaddeus laughed, the sound of a man well pleased with himself. "Indeed. In fact, why don't we make an evening of it? Worthington, you mentioned you're looking for field hands. I've got several I could part with, young, strong, should give you another 15 years of good work at least. A portly man Silas recognized as Marcus Worthington, the same man who'd taken Betsy Hale this morning, dabbed his mouth with a napkin. I'm always in the market for good stock, Thaddeus. What did you have in mind? Well, there's Ruth's boy, Ezekiel, I think his name is. 12 years old, healthy. Then there's that young woman, Hannah, who works in the kitchen. Fine specimen. And Thaddeus paused dramatically, clearly enjoying himself. How about we make it interesting? Let's have them brought here. The gentleman can examine them properly, and we'll auction them right here, tonight. Entertainment and business combined. The table erupted in approving laughter. Several men pounded the table in enthusiasm. Cordelia looked mildly uncomfortable but said nothing, such matters were her husband's domain, not hers. Preston, emboldened by bourbon and his father's approval, stood with his glass raised. Excellent idea. Let's see what Langridge stock can fetch at market. Pickett. Have the boy Ezekiel brought up. And Hannah. Let's give our guests a proper show. Something inside Silas cracked. Not broke, breaking implied sudden failure, catastrophic collapse. This was different. This was the final strand of a rope that had been fraying for 3 years, since the day they took Clara. Since the day he'd stood chained and helpless while his daughter screamed his name. The crack spread slowly, inevitably, like ice forming on winter water. His hands moved to the oilcloth bundle in his tool satchel. Inside were 3 of the pieces he'd forged that afternoon. Long iron spikes, each one etched with symbols that seemed to writhe in the candlelight. His grandmother's symbols. The old language. Below, Wade Pickett had already sent someone to fetch the boy and woman. Within minutes, they'd be paraded before these monsters, examined like horses, sold to whoever offered the highest price. Families would be ripped apart for sport, for entertainment between courses of ham and syllabub. Silas looked at the chandelier chain in his hands. 1 weak link. That's all it would take. The entire massive fixture would fall, scattering candles across the table below, onto silk dresses and cotton tablecloths. It would be called an accident. The blacksmith had been careless. No one would suspect. But that wasn't enough. Not anymore. He reached into his satchel and pulled out one of the iron spikes. In the candlelight, the symbols carved into its surface seemed almost to glow. He wedged it carefully between the chandelier's mounting bracket and the ceiling beam, concealing it in shadow where no casual observer would notice. Then a second spike, on the opposite side. The third he kept, slipping it into his belt at the small of his back where his shirt would hide it. The spikes hummed against the wood. Or perhaps that was just his imagination. Perhaps it was just the blood rushing in his ears as he descended the ladder, his work apparently complete, the weak link replaced with a strong one. The chandelier would hold now. For a while. Ezekiel and Hannah arrived as Silas reached the ground floor. The boy looked terrified, his eyes wide and darting. Hannah held herself with dignity despite the humiliation, her chin raised even as Preston Langridge circled her like a predator, commenting on her teeth, her hands, her build, as if she were livestock. Strong shoulders, Preston observed to the assembled guests. Good birthing hips. Should produce well. Shall we start the bidding at 300? Josephine stood at the edge of the room, her face carved from stone, her hands clenched at her sides. When Silas passed her on his way out, she caught his eye. No words were exchanged, but understanding passed between them, the understanding of people who'd reached the end of endurance, who'd seen one cruelty too many, who'd discovered that some fires, once lit, couldn't be stopped even if you wanted to. Silas walked out of the main house into the thick Mississippi night. The harvest moon had risen, bloated and orange, painting everything in shades of copper and blood. He could hear the bidding starting behind him, voices raised in amounts that quantified human lives in dollars and cents. His hand found the iron spike at his back, fingers tracing the symbols carved into its surface. Iron remembers, his grandmother had said. And tonight, iron would speak. Behind him, in the dining room, one of the candles in the repaired chandelier flickered. Then another. Then all of them guttered at once, as if some cold wind had blown through the room despite the stifling heat. In the brief darkness before they flared back to life, several guests would later swear they'd seen shadows moving on the ceiling, shadows that looked almost human, almost like men with arms outstretched, pinned against the beams. But that was surely just imagination. Tricks of candlelight and bourbon. Surely. Are you feeling the heat of the forge? The weight of those chains? Hit subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss our tales of historical horror. Comment your thoughts. Is this justice or damnation? Midnight found Silas Grimwood standing in the doorway of the forge, watching the quarters settle into an uneasy silence. The celebration at the main house had grown louder as the hours passed, drunken laughter carrying across the grounds like the calls of carrion birds. Ezekiel had been sold for $400. Hannah for $600. They'd be loaded onto wagons at dawn, shipped to different plantations, never to see their families again. The boy had cried. Hannah had not. Her silence had been worse somehow, the silence of someone who'd given up hoping, who'd learned that dignity was the only possession that couldn't be stolen. Silas had watched from the shadows as they were led back to the quarters, their wrists bound with rope. Not iron. He hadn't been asked to forge their chains. Small mercies, he thought bitterly, though there were no mercies in this place. Only gradations of cruelty. The forge fire still burned, kept alive by some fuel beyond wood and coal. It had been burning for 3 days without being fed, the flames dancing blue and green at their heart, occasionally throwing shadows that looked like reaching hands. Josephine had seen it this afternoon and said nothing, only nodded once and returned to the kitchen. The old ones knew. They always knew. Silas pulled the canvas sack from its hiding place behind the false stone. The remaining spikes clinked together, their weight substantial, their purpose undeniable. 7 of them, each one marked with symbols that seemed to shift and writhe in the firelight. Each one forged with blood, his blood, dripped onto the metal as it cooled, binding intent to iron, purpose to steel. He slung the sack over his shoulder and picked up his hammer. The tool felt different in his hand now, lighter somehow, as if it had been waiting its entire existence for this moment. As if every chain he'd forged, every shackle he'd shaped, had been preparation for tonight. The first flames appeared in the cotton gin house at midnight. Later, when the authorities came with their questions and notebooks, no one would be able to say exactly how the fire started. A lantern kicked over, some claimed. Spontaneous combustion from the summer heat. An ember from someone's pipe. The stories multiplied and contradicted, which was how Silas knew the truth would remain buried under conjecture and assumption. He'd started it with a brand from his forge, pressed against the mountain of cotton fiber that filled the gin house floor. The stuff caught like gunpowder, flames spreading across its surface in waves, climbing the walls, reaching for the ceiling with fingers of orange and red. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching his handiwork, feeling the heat wash over him like baptism. Then he heard the screaming start. Not from the quarters, those people had been warned, had found excuses to stay inside despite the heat, had barred their doors and shuttered their windows. No, the screaming came from near the gin house, where Dalton Merrick had been staggering drunk from the overseer's cottage, drawn by the light of the flames. Merrick stood swaying, his face slack with alcohol and confusion, watching the gin house burn. He didn't see Silas approach from behind. Didn't hear the footsteps over the roar of the fire. Didn't understand what was happening until the hammer caught him behind the knees and he went down hard onto the packed earth. What the, Grimwood? What in the hell? Silas hit him again, this time across the temple. Not hard enough to kill, but hard enough to silence. Merrick crumpled, blood trickling from his scalp, his eyes rolling back. The overseer who'd forced him to make chains for a child. Who'd taunted him about Clara. Who'd beaten Betsy Hale's mother until she couldn't stand. The barn was 30 yards away, its doors open to catch any hint of breeze. Silas dragged Merrick by his ankles, the overseer's head bouncing on the ground, leaving a trail through the dust. Merrick was heavy, 200 pounds of cruelty and bourbon, but Silas pulled him as if he weighed nothing, as if some other strength had entered his muscles, ancient and implacable. Inside the barn, the horses stamped nervously, sensing smoke and fire. Silas calmed them with soft words, easy now, easy, before releasing them into the night. They thundered out into the darkness, heading for the far pasture, away from the flames that were already spreading from the gin house to the nearby storage sheds. The barn's crossbeams were exposed oak, each one 12 inches thick, running the length of the structure 20 feet above the ground. Silas had helped raise them 10 years ago, and had shaped the iron brackets that held them to the support posts. He knew every joint, every stress point. He knew exactly where to place the spikes. Merrick groaned as consciousness returned. His eyes fluttered open, focusing with difficulty on Silas's face looming above him. "Grimwood, you're making a mistake. Master Langridge will. Master Langridge will burn," Silas said quietly. His voice was calm, almost gentle, which somehow made the words more terrible. "They all will." He bound Merrick's ankles with rope from the tack room, then his wrists, positioning the overseer beneath the central crossbeam. The ladder from earlier, borrowed from the main house, still leaned against the wall. Silas positioned it carefully, climbing with the first spike in his belt and the hammer in his hand. "What are you doing?" Merrick's voice climbed toward panic. "Grimwood, listen to me." The hammer struck the spike through Merrick's left wrist into the crossbeam with 3 massive blows. The sound echoed through the barn like church bells calling the damned to judgment. Merrick's scream cut through the night, high and animal, a sound no human throat should make. Silas descended, moved the ladder, climbed again. The right wrist required 4 blows, the spike caught bone first and had to be persuaded through. More screaming. Blood ran down Merrick's arms, dripping onto the barn floor in a steady patter like rain. When Silas was finished, Dalton Merrick hung from the crossbeam with his arms spread wide, his feet dangling 3 feet above the ground. His shadow, cast by the approaching firelight, stretched enormous across the barn wall, a crucified figure rendered in black, arms reaching toward nothing. "Why?" Merrick gasped through his agony. "Why are you doing this?" Silas stood below him, looking up at his handiwork. In the overseer's eyes, he could see genuine incomprehension. Merrick truly didn't understand. Couldn't conceive that the chains he'd helped forge, the families he'd helped destroy, the suffering he'd inflicted as casually as breathing, that all of it might demand payment. "Because iron remembers," Silas said. "And because someone has to." He left Merrick there, screaming into the darkness, and returned to the night where the fires were spreading. The gin house was fully engulfed now, flames leaping 50 feet into the air, sparks raining down on the nearby structures. The storage sheds caught next, then the carriage house, the flames moving with purpose, with direction, as if guided by intelligence. In the main house, the guests were beginning to notice. Silas could hear the confusion, the alarm, voices rising in pitch as someone shouted, "Fire!" The celebration was ending. The reckoning was beginning. Wade Pickett emerged from the overseer's quarters, already dressed despite the late hour, as if he'd been expecting something. He saw the fires and his face went cold with calculation. His hand went to the pistol at his belt as he turned toward the barn, perhaps hearing Merrick's screams, perhaps simply following instinct. He didn't see Silas until the hammer caught him across the shoulder, spinning him around. The pistol fell from his grasp, landing in the dust. Pickett was fast, he ducked the second swing and came up with a knife from his boot, slashing toward Silas's belly. But Silas was faster. Or perhaps it wasn't speed. Perhaps it was inevitable. The hammer caught Pickett's knife hand with a crunch of breaking bones. The blade tumbled away. A third blow to the temple sent the overseer sprawling. The stable was smaller than the barn, its crossbeams lower, easier to reach. Silas worked with methodical precision, binding Pickett, positioning him, climbing the ladder with spike and hammer. The overseer regained consciousness halfway through the process, as the first spike pierced his wrist. His scream joined Merrick's in a chorus of agony that carried across the plantation grounds. "You're insane," Pickett gasped, his pale eyes wide with something that might have been understanding. "You can't, this won't change anything." "No," Silas agreed, raising the hammer for the final blow. "But it will balance the books." 2 men hung from crossbeams now, their shadows dancing in the firelight. 2 men who'd built their lives on the suffering of others, who'd measured their worth in the misery they could inflict. 2 men who would burn before morning. But Silas wasn't finished. The main house blazed with light and activity. Guests were pouring out the front door, men shouting orders, women screaming. Some tried to organize bucket brigades, but the fires had spread too far, too fast. The gin house was a skeleton of flames. The storage sheds were collapsing into themselves. The barn and stable glowed from within, Merrick's and Pickett's screams still audible over the roar of burning wood. Silas moved through the smoke like a vengeful ghost, the canvas sack lighter now but still heavy with purpose. 5 spikes remaining. 5 more crosses to raise. 5 more payments to collect on debts that had compound interest measured in blood and tears. Preston Langridge ran toward the slave quarters, perhaps thinking to conscript to help fighting the fires, perhaps simply fleeing the chaos. He never saw Silas step from behind the smokehouse. Never understood what hit him until he was lying on the ground with stars exploding behind his eyes and his legs refusing to obey commands. The smokehouse crossbeams were perfect, low enough to reach, strong enough to hold, positioned where the flames would find them eventually. Silas worked quickly now, his movements practiced, efficient. Spike through the left wrist. 3 blows. Spike through the right. 4 blows this time. Preston struggled more than the others, his youth giving him strength even through the pain. When it was done, the young master hung like a grotesque scarecrow, his educated mouth still forming protests, still trying to reason with forces beyond reason. His shadow merged with the others, a growing gallery of crucified figures, each one a silent testimony to debts coming due. "Father." Preston's voice cracked with terror and pain. "Father, help me." But Thaddeus Langridge had his own problems. The plantation owner stood on his front porch, directing efforts to save the main house even as the fires crept closer. He didn't see Silas approach from the side. Didn't notice until the hammer caught him across the lower back, dropping him to his knees on his own threshold. What? Thaddeus turned, saw Silas standing over him with the hammer raised, and something like understanding finally dawned in his eyes. "You. The blacksmith. What have you done?" "What you taught me," Silas said. "I've learned from the master." He dragged Thaddeus Langridge off the porch and across the yard toward the carriage house, where the crossbeams waited and the fires were already licking at the walls. Behind them, the plantation burned. Around them, the night filled with screams and smoke and the sound of a hammer falling, again and again, like the beating of an iron heart. The carriage house held the stench of leather and horse sweat, familiar smells now overlaid with smoke that crept through every crack in the walls. Thaddeus Langridge thrashed against the ropes binding his wrists, his face purple with rage and terror in equal measure. Blood trickled from where Silas had struck him, matting the silver hair at his temple. "You'll hang for this," Thaddeus snarled, his voice hoarse. "They'll hunt you down like the animal you are. They'll make an example." The hammer caught him across the mouth, splitting his lip, sending teeth skittering across the floor like scattered dice. Thaddeus spat blood and fell silent, perhaps finally understanding that the old order had dissolved in fire and fury, that his words carried no weight in this new hell he'd helped create. Silas positioned the ladder beneath the crossbeam, the last ladder, the final ascent. His arms ached from the night's work, from dragging grown men and driving iron through flesh and bone. But the pain felt distant, abstract, as if his body belonged to someone else and he was merely a passenger observing from far away. He climbed with Thaddeus Langridge bound and gagged, hauling the plantation owner's dead weight with strength that shouldn't have been possible. The master of Langridge Estate fought weakly, but 3 blows to the head had taken the strength from his limbs, left him dazed and pliant. The spikes went through cleaner than the others. Perhaps Silas had perfected his technique. Perhaps the iron itself had learned what was required. 3 blows for the left wrist. 3 for the right. Thaddeus's screams were muffled by the gag, which was mercy of a sort, though mercy wasn't what Silas had come to deliver. When it was done, the master of Langridge Estate hung from his own carriage house crossbeam, arms spread in unwilling benediction, his shadow stretching across the wall behind him, a dark prophet proclaiming the end of his own gospel. Silas descended the ladder and stood looking up at his work. 4 men now hung from crossbeams across the plantation. 4 architects of suffering, each one positioned where the approaching flames would find them, where their shadows would be the last thing they saw before the fire took them. But the night wasn't finished. Through the smoke and chaos, 2 more figures moved across the grounds, visitors who'd come for the harvest celebration and stayed for their own destruction. Luther Carmichael and James Vernon, planters from adjoining counties, drunk enough to think they could save valuables from the main house before it burned. They stumbled toward the building with the foolish courage of men who'd never faced real consequences, who believed their whiteness and wealth made them invulnerable. Silas intercepted them near the well house, emerging from smoke like something summoned. His hammer rose and fell twice, efficient and economical. They dropped without understanding what had happened, their minds too fogged with bourbon and panic to process the sudden darkness that claimed them. The smokehouse Crossbeams took Carmichael. The feed shed took Vernon. The work was mechanical now, ritualistic, each spike driven with the precision of a craftsman completing a masterwork. When Silas finished, 6 men hung from 6 crossbeams across Langridge Estate, their arms spread, their shadows merging and multiplying in the firelight until the entire plantation seemed populated by crucified ghosts. From the quarters, the enslaved watched in silence. They'd barricaded themselves inside as Josephine had instructed, but faces appeared at windows and cracks in doors, bearing witness to the night's terrible accounting. No one moved to help the burning men. No one raised an alarm or attempted rescue. They simply watched as the world they'd been forced to build consumed itself in flames that seemed almost holy in their fury. Josephine stood in her doorway, her gray-streaked hair loose around her shoulders, her lips moving in words that might have been prayer or might have been something older. Around her neck hung a small pouch that hadn't been there yesterday, herbs and roots and perhaps a sliver of iron, protection against forces that walked tonight on both sides of the living world. Young Marcus pressed against her side, his eyes wide with terror and something that might have been awe. "Miss Josephine, is Mr. Silas going to be all right?" "All right?" The old woman's laugh was bitter as medicine. "Child, ain't nobody going to be all right after tonight. But maybe we'll be free." The main house was the last to fully catch, but when it did, it went up like a funeral pyre built for kings. The flames found the expensive curtains first, then the imported furniture, then the walls themselves. Cordelia Langridge had fled screaming into the night with several other women, running toward the road in their silk dresses, their faces streaked with ash and tears. They would live. Silas had no quarrel with them, they were complicit, certainly, but they hadn't wielded the whip, hadn't forged the chains of commerce that measured human worth in dollars. Besides, they would carry the story. They would tell what happened here. They would spread the word that some debts, when left unpaid too long, collect themselves with interest. The fires spread with unnatural purpose, leaping from structure to structure as if guided by invisible hands. The cotton fields caught next, the bowls exploding in puffs of white that turned to ash before they hit the ground. A year's harvest gone in minutes, burning like scattered stars falling to earth. The flames painted everything orange and red and gold, turning night into a hellish approximation of day. Silas stood in the center of the conflagration, untouched by the heat that should have killed him, watching his work reach its culmination. Embers swirled around him like fireflies. Smoke twisted into shapes that looked almost human, his grandmother, his daughter, countless others whose names he'd never known but whose suffering he'd witnessed. The dead were here tonight, called by blood and iron, bearing witness to justice served hot from the forge. A figure stumbled through the smoke toward him, Wade Pickett, somehow still alive despite the spike through his wrists, despite the fire that had already claimed half the stable. The overseer had torn himself free somehow, leaving meat and bone behind on the crossbeam, his hands ruined but his legs still working. He lurched toward Silas with his pale eyes blazing with hatred and agony in equal measure. "You think this changes anything?" Pickett gasped, each word an effort. Blood poured from his wrists in pulsing streams. "You're still property. Still nothing." Silas looked at him with something that might have been pity if pity had survived the night's work. "Wrong," he said quietly. "I was never nothing. You just convinced yourself I was so you could sleep at night." He raised the hammer one final time. Pickett tried to dodge but his body betrayed him, weakened by blood loss and shock. The blow caught him square in the temple, and the overseer dropped like a felled tree, his pale eyes going dark, his last breath rattling out across the burning ground. Dawn was perhaps an hour away when the authorities finally arrived. Sheriff Marcus Brentwood and his deputies, roused from their beds by frantic messengers, rode hard toward the fires that painted the sky orange for miles around. They found a vision of hell made manifest, buildings reduced to skeletons of flame, cotton fields burning in waves, and throughout the property, silhouetted against the inferno, the shapes of men pinned to crossbeams with their arms spread wide. Some of the bodies had burned beyond recognition. Others were still screaming, though their voices had gone hoarse and thin. The deputies vomited at the sight, at the smell of burning flesh and wood, at the sheer enormity of destruction. But they found no blacksmith. No hammer. No canvas sack. Silas Grimwood had vanished into the smoke and darkness as thoroughly as if he'd never existed. Some of the enslaved claimed they'd seen him walking south toward the delta, his silhouette visible against the flames. Others swore he'd gone east toward Georgia. A few whispered that he'd simply dissolved into the fire itself, returned to the element he'd worked with all his life. Only Josephine knew the truth, and she kept it locked behind her teeth. She'd given him food for the journey, a map drawn from memory, and the names of people who might help, conductors on a railroad that ran beneath the surface of the South, carrying cargo worth more than cotton toward freedom. She'd watched him disappear into the pre-dawn darkness with his hammer slung over his shoulder and his hands still stained with blood and soot. "Go with the old ones," she'd whispered, pressing something into his palm, his grandmother's iron thorn, the one that had come from across the sea. "Let them guide your steps. And Silas? Don't stop walking. Not ever." He'd nodded once, then turned and melted into shadows that seemed eager to claim him. By the time the sun rose fully over Langridge Estate, the fires had burned themselves out, leaving only ash and memory. The main house was a charred skeleton. The outbuildings were gone entirely. The cotton field stretched black and desolate under a sky stained with smoke. And on every crossbeam that remained standing, the silhouettes were burned into the wood, dark shadows of men with arms outstretched, branded into oak and pine by heat and horror. They would remain there for years, because no one could bring themselves to cut the beams down. They stood as monuments or warnings, depending on who looked at them. The authorities catalogued the dead: Thaddeus Langridge, plantation owner; Preston Langridge, his son; Dalton Merrick and Wade Pickett, overseers; Luther Carmichael and James Vernon, visiting planters. All found pinned to crossbeams with iron spikes driven through their wrists. All burned or burning when discovered. The enslaved were questioned extensively, but their stories contradicted and multiplied. Some claimed to have seen nothing through the smoke. Others said the fires started accidentally, spreading too fast to control. A few mentioned a blacksmith, but descriptions varied wildly: tall or short, young or old, quiet or raging. It was as if they were describing different men, or perhaps no man at all. Only one detail remained consistent: the spikes. Each one bore the same mark, a symbol that looked almost like a signature, almost like writing in a language no one could read. They were clearly custom forged, made by someone with exceptional skill. Made by a blacksmith who would never be found. The federal marshal who arrived 3 days later stood among the ruins, his notebook filled with contradictions and impossibilities. He examined the spikes that had been pried from crossbeams, studied the burn patterns that suggested multiple simultaneous ignitions, interviewed witnesses whose stories shifted like smoke. Spontaneous combustion, he finally declared in his official report. Combined with structural failures and panic. A tragedy, but not a crime. No one believed him, but no one contradicted him either. Some truths were too dangerous to speak aloud. The enslaved of Langridge Estate were sold at auction 3 weeks later to settle debts. They scattered across 5 counties, carrying with them the story of the night iron spoke and fire answered. The story grew in the telling, mutating and multiplying, until it became legend, the tale of the blacksmith who pinned masters to crossbeams and walked away while the world burned. And sometimes, on hot Mississippi nights when the air hung heavy and still, people claimed they could hear it, the distant sound of a hammer striking metal, moving south through the delta darkness, forging something new from the ashes of the old. The federal marshal's boots crunched through ash that had once been ambition and empire. 3 days had passed since the fires, 3 days of cooling embers and questions that multiplied like weeds in scorched earth. Marshal Edmund Hargrove had seen his share of violence in 15 years of service: slave uprisings put down with methodical brutality, lynchings dressed up as justice, massacres whitewashed into footnotes. But nothing had prepared him for the systematic horror of Langridge Estate. 6 men. 6 crossbeams. 6 shadows burned into wood like some obscene parody of crucifixion. He stood beneath what remained of the barn's frame, studying the crossbeam where Dalton Merrick had hung. The wood was charred black, but the outline remained, arms spread, head tilted, the posture of agony frozen in carbon and memory. The spike that had held the overseer's left wrist lay in Hargrove's hand, heavy and purposeful. Its surface bore markings that his educated eye recognized as deliberate, symbols etched with precision, each line and curve intentional. "Sir." Deputy Clayton approached with his handkerchief pressed to his nose against the lingering stench of burnt flesh. "The smithy's been searched thoroughly. No sign of the blacksmith. But we found this." He held out a leather-bound journal, its pages water-stained and smoke-damaged but mostly legible. Hargrove opened it carefully, scanning the contents. Inventory lists. Material orders. Work logs dating back 15 years, all in the same meticulous hand. The final entry was dated 2 days before the fire: repair work, smokehouse hinge. Special commission, child's restraints, per d. Merrick instruction. Hargrove's jaw tightened. He'd interviewed Josephine, the old cook, who'd confirmed the detail with flat, emotionless words. Master Langridge sold Betsy Hale, aged 8, to Worthington Plantation. Needed manacles small enough for her wrists. Made Silas forge them. The marshal had daughters himself. He closed the journal with more force than necessary. What about the slaves? He asked. Any break in their stories? No, sir. Still claiming they saw nothing useful through the smoke. A woman named Ruth says she was tending her sick cousin. A man named Ezekiel, one of the ones sold that night, says he was locked in the quarters. They all corroborate each other, but... Clayton hesitated. It feels rehearsed, sir. Like they decided on a story and stuck to it. Of course they did. Hargrove pocketed the spike, feeling its weight pull at his coat. Wouldn't you? The deputy said nothing, which was answer enough. They walked the grounds in silence, cataloguing devastation. The main house was a blackened shell, its columns toppled like felled gods. The cotton gin house had collapsed entirely into its own foundation. Storage sheds, stables, smokehouse, carriage house, all reduced to ash and memory. Only the slave quarters remained intact, untouched by flames that had consumed everything else with apparent purpose. That detail troubled Hargrove more than he cared to admit. Fire didn't discriminate. Fire didn't choose. Yet the quarters stood unscathed while everything around them burned, as if the flames themselves had made a decision about what deserved destruction. At the well house, he found Josephine drawing water for the remaining enslaved who hadn't yet been sold. She moved with the careful dignity of someone who'd survived too much to be impressed by authority. Her gray-streaked hair was wrapped in a faded blue tignon, her hands steady as she worked the pump. "Ma'am," Hargrove said, removing his hat. "I need to ask you about the blacksmith again." "Already told you everything I know, Marshal." Her voice was neutral, empty of inflection. "You knew him well." "As well as anybody could know Silas. He kept to himself mostly. Did good work. Lost his daughter 3 years back, sold to settle a debt." Josephine met his eyes directly, something few enslaved people dared with white authorities. "That kind of loss changes a man. Change him enough to do this?" Hargrove gestured at the ruins surrounding them. "Marshal, I'm just a cook. What do I know about what drives a man to desperate acts?" But her eyes said everything her words didn't. She knew exactly what drove desperate acts, had probably contemplated a few herself over 60 years of bondage. Hargrove studied her face, looking for cracks in the facade. He found none. Whatever Josephine knew, she'd take it to her grave or the auction block, whichever came first. "If he contacts you," he began. "He won't." Flat. Final. The conversation was over. The marshal spent another hour examining the other crossbeams, the other shadows. Wade Pickett in a stable, his body found 50 yards from where he'd been pinned, apparently having torn himself free before bleeding out. Preston Langridge in the smokehouse, burned beyond recognition, identifiable only by his signet ring. Thaddeus Langridge in the carriage house, the plantation's patriarch reduced to charred meat and bone. Each spike bore the same mark. Each shadow told the same story. Each death spoke of deliberate, methodical purpose. By week's end, Marshal Hargrove filed his report with the federal courthouse in Jackson, catastrophic fire of undetermined origin resulting in 6 fatalities. Evidence suggests possible involvement of enslaved blacksmith, Silas Grimwood, who remains at large. However, lack of witnesses and conflicting testimony make prosecution unlikely. Recommend case be classified as industrial accident with complicating factors. It was a lie dressed up in bureaucratic language, and everyone knew it. But it was a lie that served purposes beyond truth. It prevented an investigation that might inspire other enslaved people to similar acts, avoided admitting that the system could be challenged by those it claimed to own, and maintained the fiction that order prevailed in the South. The enslaved of Langridge Estate were dispersed at auction on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks after the fires. Josephine went for $200 to a plantation near Natchez. Young Marcus and his mother were sold as a pair to a cotton operation in Arkansas. Ruth and her son Ezekiel, originally slated for separate sales, were purchased together by a Quaker named Pemberton who had a reputation for eventually freeing his workers. They carried the story with them, spreading it through the invisible network that connected the enslaved across the South. The tale grew in the telling, acquiring mythic dimensions: the blacksmith who challenged heaven and hell both, who pinned his masters to wood like insects in a collector's case, who walked away from the inferno untouched by flame or consequence. Some said he'd died in the fires, consumed by the same force he'd unleashed. Others claimed he'd made it to the north, guided by the Underground Railroad, living free in Canada under a new name. A few whispered that he'd never left at all, that he moved through the South like a ghost, leaving fires in his wake wherever cruelty grew too thick to breathe through. The truth was stranger and simpler. Silas Grimwood walked for 3 weeks, moving only at night, sleeping in root cellars and hidden spaces provided by people Josephine had named. He carried his hammer and his grandmother's iron thorn, nothing else. His hands bore scars from the night's work, burns and cuts, and the permanent stain of soot worked deep into his skin. He reached the Mississippi River near Memphis, crossed it on a ferry operated by a free black man who asked no questions but provided bread and information. From there, he moved east through Tennessee, following routes marked by quilts hanging on porches and lanterns placed in specific windows. Near Knoxville, he stopped at a small forge operated by a man named Samuel, who'd bought his own freedom 20 years prior and now helped others do the same. Samuel needed an assistant, someone skilled in the craft, someone who understood that iron could be more than chains. Silas stayed 3 months, working and healing, before moving on again. The pattern repeated itself: a forge in Kentucky, another in Ohio, each one a way station on a journey without a clear destination. He never stayed long enough to put down roots, never revealed his past, but word spread nonetheless through channels invisible to white authorities. A blacksmith who could forge anything. Whose work bore strange marks that some claimed brought luck, that others swore whispered protection against evil. A quiet man who never smiled but whose presence brought comfort to those who'd suffered similar losses. And sometimes, in the deep South where cotton still reigned and bondage persisted, fires broke out on plantations known for exceptional cruelty. Structures burned with suspicious precision. Overseers vanished. Masters woke to find their tools rearranged in patterns that looked almost like symbols, almost like warnings. The authorities investigated but found nothing, or found too much, stories that contradicted and multiplied until truth became impossible to separate from legend. A blacksmith here. A fire there. Always moving, always south, as if some gravitational force pulled him back toward the delta, toward unfinished business, toward debts still unpaid. 5 years after Langridge Estate burned, a newspaper in Charleston reported a similar incident: mysterious conflagration destroys Beaumont plantation. 6 overseers were found deceased in suspicious circumstances. Authorities seek itinerant blacksmith for questioning. 10 years later, a report from Georgia: Whitfield cotton operation consumed by fire. Multiple fatalities. Witnesses describe seeing a man with a hammer walking south through the flames, untouched. The reports accumulated, each one slightly different, each one containing the same essential elements: fire and iron, crosses and shadows, a blacksmith who appeared from nowhere and vanished like smoke. Marshall Hargrove, retired by then and living in Virginia, collected the newspaper clippings in a folder he kept locked in his desk. He'd pull it out occasionally when he couldn't sleep, reading the accounts and wondering. Was it the same man? A copycat? Multiple men inspired by the same story? Or had Silas Grimwood become something other than human that night at Langridge Estate, transformed into a force that moved through the South like divine retribution wearing human skin? He never found answers. No one did. The crossbeams of Langridge Estate remained standing for 30 years, their shadows refusing to fade even as wood grayed and weathered. Travelers avoided the ruins. Locals claimed the place was cursed, haunted by the screaming of men who'd learned too late that cruelty compounds like interest, that debts of blood can never be fully discharged. Eventually, time and weather brought the beams down, collapsing them into the earth they'd overshadowed. But the ground itself remained barren, nothing would grow where the plantation had stood, as if the soil remembered what had been planted there and refused to nurture anything new. On certain nights, when the Mississippi air hung thick and still, people passing the ruins claimed they could hear it, the distant sound of a hammer striking metal, rhythmic and patient, forging something in darkness. The sound moved south through the delta, eternal and inexorable, a heartbeat that refused to stop. And perhaps, In some foundry or forge or secret place where iron still remembered and fire still spoke, an old man worked by lamplight, his hands scarred and steady, shaping metal into purposes his grandmother would have recognized. Perhaps he was training apprentices in the old ways, teaching them that tools could be weapons, that justice sometimes required heat and pressure, that some things, once forged, could never be unmade. Or perhaps he was simply a story, a legend told to comfort the suffering and terrify the cruel, the blacksmith who pinned masters to crossbeams and walked away while their world burned. Either way, the hammer kept falling. The fires kept burning. And in the darkness between heartbeats, iron whispered its ancient truths to anyone brave enough or desperate enough to listen. If this story has branded itself into your mind like hot iron, show your support by subscribing. Share your reaction in the comments. What would you have done in the blacksmith's place?